Welcome back. My guest is Advocate Terry Mutau, the lead investigator into the VBS Bank heist. He's in the studio with us to tell us a bit more about this report of 2 billion rands being made to disappear into the pockets of more than 53 people. We'll talk about those in a moment. But first, let's hear what the Premier of Gauteng, David Makhura, had to say about this development.
I think one of the issues I talk about is that the world faces an ethical crisis, and that ethical crisis is manifesting itself in different forms in different countries. In some instances, greed and avarice manifesting itself in public institutions, where public institutions and public resources are hijacked for private gain, but also even in the private sector, where institutions are hijacked for private gain. People keep wanting to take more and more and more. So VBS is a practical example where huge resources were fleeced out of savings of poor people in the rural areas who save this money to help improve their own conditions, but also to educate their children. So the central question about VBS is greed and greed and greed.
How does this set back the agenda? I know the ANC.
Well, that's the Premier of Gauteng. And is that the sense you had when you were going through the investigation and reading the different reports?
I identify entirely with his summation. It is an accurate reflection.
And I'll go back to something I said earlier on, and you said, you know, it should be common that people do the right thing, that we should not be surprised or be too carried away when somebody shows courage and tells the truth as is objectively. But, you know, some of the people that are implicated in the report are professional people. So if you're an advocate, then we must take your word for it. If you're an accountant, we believe you know what you're doing. If you're an auditor, we believe your word. If you are a king, for that matter, we believe that you are leading people the right way. And I get to the point of the Vavenda King Ramabulan. How does he get to be involved in all of this?
In terms of the investigation, there was an entity called Shivambu, in which the king held a stake, and it is through that stake that he held that a stake was bought or purchased within the bank, and that's how he comes into the picture. And later he became, as I understand, a stakeholder, and I put it no higher than that, within the entity Vele, which is what is represented according to the documents as the majority shareholder.
So in a way, he was not actively involved in the operations of the whole bank, and
no.
he may be mentioned as somebody who did receive some payments from the bank, but he was not necessarily involved in the operations. No. Now, tell me about the methodology that you adopted when you compiled this report.
A number of interviews were held with people, and those fall into different categories. You have people who volunteered and said, please, we have something to share. Would you afford us an opportunity to come through? And you have a category of persons who were summoned, for lack of a better description, in terms of the section, one of the sections in the Act that grants the power to do so. And particularly people that we identified as being implicated in terms of the documents that were at our disposal. Those are people that we called to come so that they be afforded an opportunity to put their side of the story. And people were allowed legal representation. That was clearly stipulated in the notices. And even those who elected not to be legally represented, they were asked that in terms of the notice, you had this right, or you have this right. I note that you are not accompanied by any legal representative. Is that your choice to represent yourself? And people, those who made that election, confirmed under oath at the commencement of the interviews. So, and you had people there that were represented by senior counsel with attorneys. So the question of representation was adequately addressed. And people were given adequate notice, because if somebody had been given a short notice, they would have said, well, I'm not ready because I'm not available at that time. Would an alternative slot work, and would accommodate those people, because you want the process to be as fair as possible.
You know, there's something else in South Africa that we sometimes misunderstand. Now that you are the one who's talking about this report, some people might feel you just volunteered, woke up one morning and said, I'm going to take a look at what's going on at VBS. And it did not work that way, right? You were appointed by the South African Reserve Bank. Is that correct? So let's take a look at how this came about. And this was at a briefing to Parliament.
When we put VBS under curatorship, we put it under curatorship with the intent of saving it, with the exact same intent. When on the day that we put it under curatorship, I was reasonably confident that we'll be able to save it. I'm slightly less confident now. There might still be a chance that it's salvageable. But the issues are quite different. In some ways, when African Bank was put under curatorship, it had a liquidity problem. It appears as though VBS not just has a liquidity problem, but probably a solvency problem as well. Right? What we are uncovering is significant amounts of fraud in the bank, significant amounts of depositors' funds that have gone missing. And so while the fact that it's a black-owned bank is a positive, it is certainly a negative that there are 22,700 small retail depositors in Venda who have their money trapped in VBS. Right? The average deposit is about 38,000 Rand. So there are 22,500 people there who don't have access to their money. They're black too. Right? And it's our job to protect their interests and to ensure that they do get their money back.
And that is the point of the investigation, as the Deputy Governor at the South African Reserve Bank, Kuben Naidu, is explaining there. Because sometimes we worry about the big people that are being mentioned and forgetting that there are 22,500 of ordinary folk who placed their trust and their monies with the bank and who lost portion of it, as much as the Reserve Bank is coming to their assistance, and municipalities as well. How much money did the municipalities place with the bank?
The amounts are very significant. I haven't looked at the report, but there's a section in which that is tabulated.
Yes.
I mean, the amounts are significant.
Yeah. So the major portion would have been
the major portion. Yes. Yeah. But the context is also important. That happened in circumstances where legislation does not permit municipalities to place their investments with a mutual bank. Bearing in mind, VBS is not the only mutual bank in the country. There are other mutual banks. That prohibition equally applies to them. The National Treasury issued a notice to caution municipalities against this. The National Treasury was disregarded, and we now find ourselves in this.
The chairman,
Yes.
the chairperson of Vale Investments and VBS, I read a report where he says this report reads like a novel to him, implying that there might be some creative stories that are told about the scheme. Be that as it may, it's a heist, it's big, and it has fascinated, captured the public's imagination. Just give me a sense of how the scam worked. How did it work, actually?
And the question that you asked me just now is relevant to this. Municipalities placed their deposits. Those were actual deposits. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there are fictitious deposits that are created within the bank that obviously create a hole, because no amount has been placed for a fictitious deposit. Money will then have to be taken from an actual deposit in order to meet the commitment of a fictitious deposit.
Yeah.
And that is why you find yourself, that's why the bank finds itself in this situation, that there was no money, because money that was intended to be kept there as an investment is the money that was used within a few hours, in some instances, taken to fulfill the fictitious deposits that were then honored by and large on the instructions of the chairman.
And how does it end up in the pockets or the accounts of, well, we know of the 53. How many are there anyway, the people who took money fraudulently from the bank?
The report says you have a minimum of 53. The number exceeds that. And the reason why there are no specifics, one will appreciate that even in terms of the structure of the report, you would have seen that there are certain appendices that are mentioned but are not included in the copy that was released to the public, because we don't want to compromise the further investigations that should unfold from the various entities.
So there are further investigations that are taking place?
Yes, for example, we've made a recommendation to SARS, which also has the power to institute criminal proceedings. You have the NPA that take a different angle. And
well, there are a couple of controversial stories that have evolved from the report.
Yes.
And one, I have to mention the fact that even the chief financial officer of the South African Police Services seems to be a beneficiary who was involved in this. Is that correct?
Correct.
That's Mr.
Mr. Ramikosi.
Ramikosi.
Yes.
And then, of course, we've heard of the brother of the deputy president of the EFF, Floyd, Shivambu. And then the link is being made to Floyd, and it has generated its own issue as a side issue to this. And then people have turned around and said, but what has it got to do with the EFF? What's your view of the controversy surrounding the fact that you mentioned Floyd Shivambu's brother?
Well, can I deal with the two persons that you've mentioned?
Yeah.
Because they fall into two different categories. Mr. Ramikosi came and testified, and he protested his innocence for the better part of the day. And when he realized that more and more evidence was being put to him, he eventually cracked, for lack of a better description, and confessed. And he confessed to a scheme which is common amongst the entities and persons who were receiving monies from slush funds that were created within the bank at the direction of the chairman. So I put Mr. Ramikosi in a different category. Let me deal with Mr. Shivambu. The report makes it plain that what is intended by mentioning the 53 entities, and by perhaps persons, both juristic and natural. What the report says is, we are not pronouncing on the guilt or otherwise of persons. The report just says, was there money that was stolen from the bank? Yes. Was it paid to persons? Yes. Who are the persons? Here they are. And how much did they receive? Nowhere does the report, when it comes to those people, say these people are guilty of stealing money from the bank. And you'll understand the reason why that is so. It is that these people will be confronted, in terms of the recommendations flowing from the findings, they should be confronted by the law enforcement officers for them to explain the connection between the money missing from the bank and ending up in their accounts, without presuming any guilt at this stage.
And just brief comment from you.
Yes.
That is the next stage to the report. Is that what's going to happen?
Well, we've made recommendations.
Yeah.
It is up to the Reserve Bank to decide whether they are going to extend the scope of the mandate beyond that.
Okay.
Because you you get given terms of reference, you investigate, you make findings, and you make recommendations. You are then functus.
All right.
But just to come back with
well, let me just end it here, because
yes.
we have used our share of the time.
Okay.
But let me thank you for coming through. And besides, we're going to trouble you in the media anyway to talk some more about some of the information that's coming out.
Thank you.
Advocate Terry Mutau is our guest, and he compiled that report of the VBS Bank heist. And when we return, we're going to be focusing on the mining sector with Bernard Swanepoel.